All right, folks, Stan, welcome back to Flying for Money. We have a preliminary report from Jeju Air 2216 crash. Kind of a thin report. There are a few additional bits of information that are in this report that we wanted to cover. So we're going to hop right into it. If you have not seen my previous coverage, if you want some more information on that coverage, at the end of the video, I will have a link there. You can go watch some previous videos, particularly with regard to the failure of the CVR and FDR recordings we're looking at right here. So CVR, FDR recordings stopped working about 4 minutes prior to the crash. There was also a transponder which sends information to NTSB. Those two devices, the CVR and FDR, stopped recording 4 minutes prior to the crash. I talked about how that might happen with regards to the electrical architecture of the aircraft. So you can click on that and you can get a more in-depth description of it. I know a lot of people are concerned about that, even sort of angry about it, in disbelief that a modern aircraft would not have backup battery power, an emergency source of power for cockpit voice recorders and flight data recorders. However, that appears to be the case here. And it's something that up until the previous 20 years was really not that uncommon. First aircraft I was a captain on was a Beech 1900. This was some time ago. I remember in that aircraft, if we had a total loss of normal electrical systems, the generators in the engine that produce electrical power to the aircraft, if we wound up on the batteries, which would be considered an emergency electrical state, if we wound up in the batteries, the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder would not work. Now, the reason why they don't work is because with battery power, you have a limited amount of electricity to power the components for a limited amount of time to get the aircraft on the ground safely. You don't want to run out of electricity because you're powering a CVR and an FDR when you could have that power reserved for a critical flight component. In other words, not one drop of blood out of Jeju Air Flight 2216 is due to the cockpit voice recorder, the flight data recorder, the CVR, FDR not functioning. Has absolutely nothing to do with the fatalities, has absolutely nothing to do with this particular crash, doesn't have any part of safety with this particular flight, is not a safety item on this particular flight. However, having that information allows us to inform the public what happened. That has value. Even more value is it allows us to evaluate in greater detail what may have caused it so that we can respond and in the future create safety initiatives that prevent these types of accidents from happening again. Very valuable. And that's why, particularly in the U.S., for the past 20 years, they've been required to be installed with backup sources of electricity so that we'd continue to have CVR and FDR data even in the event of a normal electrical failure where you go into the emergency electrical system. So moving on from there into some of the other interesting things here. 3 systems, CVR, FDR, and transponder all failed simultaneously apparently, which indicates the failure in the normal electrical system, that they were on backup power. I'm not going to talk too much about the systems implication, but it goes some distance in describing why the gear may not have been extended for the landing, why the flaps may not have been extended, why the spoilers in the rollout weren't extended, which would have greatly improved the ability of the aircraft to slow down on the runway. It describes that. It helps us to describe that. At 8:54 and 43 seconds, HL 8088, that's actually the registration number of the aircraft. It was Jeju Air Flight 2216, but the aircraft registration was HL 8088. So at 8:54:43, they first communicated for landing with Air Traffic Control Tower of Muan International Airport. The tower cleared to land on runway 1. While they were approaching the runway, the tower advised the airplane at 8:57:50, so about 3 minutes after the first contact, they advised the airplane to be cautious of bird activity. Both the CVR and FDR recordings stopped exactly 1 minute later at 8:58:50. We don't really know what this caution of bird activity was about. Was that a general thing that the tower would say to all aircraft approaching Muan International Airport? Birds, there's some bird sanctuaries around the airport. It's by the water. Oftentimes there's a lot of birds around the water. So it could be something that a caution they gave to every single aircraft approaching the airport. Or was that a specific alert? Perhaps a preceding aircraft that had landed there had told Tower that they had seen birds, say, a mile from the end of the runway, and Tower was passing that along. They were letting this crew know that there was an active sort of alert for that bird activity, as more of a general alert to bird activity. They don't describe that in any detail here, so we don't know which it was. But a minute prior to the event, whatever it was that took place, they alerted them to be cautious of bird activity. So it says after a few seconds, 6 seconds after the CVR and FDR recording stopped, And this is where we're maybe running into a little bit of confusion here. The aircraft made an emergency declaration, Mayday 3 times for a bird strike during a go-around. So I believe what they said was Mayday, 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 bird strike, bird strike, bird strike, go around, go around, go around. This is probably written in Korean and translated to English, so there's a little bit of ambiguity here, and it may be a translative source of that ambiguity. But the way that it reads in this English translated document is that they made the mayday for a bird strike during go around, that the bird strike occurred during go around. I don't think that's actually what's being said here, and I don't think that's actually what happened. We have some data from the ADSB that supports the idea that they struck the birds first and then went around, or they struck the birds concurrently with the decision to go around, that this wasn't a go around, and in the go around they struck the birds. We'll get to that in a minute to describe it. I think probably the way this would be better phrased would be that during the go around they communicated with ATC, and in that communication they told them that they had had a bird strike. That this was not necessarily that they'd had a bird strike during the go-around. So a little bit ambiguous there, but we'll get into why I don't believe they had the bird strike in the go-around, why I think that occurred either before the go-around and was a cause of the go-around, or occurred concurrently with their decision to go around. And then they get into details here that we're already familiar with. So they were runway 1, they went around, they offset to the left a little bit, and then they made a right 180-degree turn to land on runway 19. Then they belly landed, they skidded down the runway, and unfortunately they crashed into a berm at the end of the runway, and we do have that berm here, and this is what that berm looks like, the aftermath looks like. Pretty devastating. This is the berm right here that they hit. I think a lot of you have probably already seen that. I want to talk about that a little bit too. Obviously, the survivability of the crash was significantly adversely impacted by the presence of this immovable object. So they hit this object at a high rate of speed, and you can see it was an explosive result. When you have a ton of energy that gets dissipated in a very, very, very rapid moment, that's essentially an explosion. That's a bomb. And so that's what it looks like. So they dissipated energy almost instantaneously, a great deal of energy almost instantaneously. And then the debris field still moved forward at such a velocity, it actually blew that wall out. So this was going to be a fatal accident no matter what. The survivability was greatly diminished. There would have been more survivors almost definitely if this wall had not been there. But having seen some of these types of overruns at high speed before, the survival rate is generally less than 50%. It probably would have been at least 100 people killed no matter what. Even if they hadn't had this wall, if they'd gone through this retaining wall here, eventually a wing would have grabbed a berm, an engine would have grabbed a berm, the aircraft would have started cartwheeling, it would have broke apart, and it would have caught on fire. The fuel from the tanks would have spilled out and would have caught on fire, and a lot of people would have died. That's what would have happened. But there would have been a much better odds of survivability. There would have been a better survival rate. So certainly this berm resulted in more fatalities than were necessary, but this was going to be a fatality event no matter what. So we just want to take a look at that image. It's a very striking image. They did recover both engines. Bird bloodstains were found on each engine. Samples were sent to specialized organizations for DNA analysis, and they identified them as belonging to Baikal teals. I think I'm pronouncing that right, Baikal teals. We do have an example of Baikal teals. We'll kind of come back here, and you can see this is a Baikal teal. It's not necessarily a very large bird. However, they apparently group in very large groupings. And so this is an example actually out of South Korea of the type of sort of flocks, the size that they potentially can grow into. That's a very, very, very large flock of birds. We don't have any evidence right now that the flock was nearly that large or that imposing. Going around because they saw that flock would make sense. If somehow they wound up flying into a flock like that and the quickest means of escape was to climb and to go around, it would make sense for them to go around in that case as well. So you have a little bit of an example here, but we don't have any evidence that the flock was nearly that large. So we don't know. It could have been a much smaller flock of birds, but we just don't have that information at this time. Moving on to the flight crew themselves, the captain was pretty experienced. 6,823 hours, 6,100 hours in the 737. That's a lot of airframe experience. He would have known the 737 very well. As a pilot in command of the 737, he had almost 2,600 hours, 2,559 hours. That's pretty good command experience. He'd been a captain for probably about 3 years or more to get that sort of experience. So good experience. The first officer, on the other hand, had 1,650 total hours, not an awful lot in the United States for someone who's trained as a civilian to be a pilot. The minimum is 1,500 hours. If you go through a 4-year dedicated aviation program, you can get that down to 1,000 hours. That's a minimum to be hired. He had 1,615 hours total. He'd been flying the 737 for 1,339 hours, which means that he had about 300 and change hours in aircraft other than a 737. Obviously, you don't start training in a 737. You start training in smaller aircraft. A good likelihood that he may have come somewhere like the U.S. to do his training. I don't know how much training they do in South Korea, but a lot of Asian carriers send pilots to the U.S. to do initial training. 300 hours is about what you have to do to get your commercial license. You can get a little bit less than 300 hours, but 300 hours sounds like he did his primary training somewhere. He got his single engine rating, he got his private rating, he got his instrument add-on, he got his commercial rating, he got his multi-engine rating, and then he went back immediately into the 737. The 1,339 hours in the 737 is not necessarily low time. For reasonable experience in the 737, he would have known the aircraft reasonably well, but 300 and something hours means he didn't have much command experience. And command experience is kind of significant when you encounter a situation like this. So the captain would have been very overloaded initially when the event took place. He probably would have taken controls of the aircraft. He would have been diagnosing the issue. He would have been figuring out what he needed to do next. He would have been very, very time compressed. It appears as though he had a failure in the number 1 engine, a loss of thrust in the number 2 engine, was having a hard time maintaining airspeed and altitude simultaneously. So he needed to make a quick return to runway 19. He had to communicate with air traffic control during this period. He should have been communicating with his flight attendants as well, letting them know they were in an emergency. They needed to brief the passengers to brace for impact and be prepared mentally to evacuate the aircraft. A lot of stuff he had to do in 4 minutes. And he also had to identify the fact that this had actually happened, to be surprised, to get over the shock, and to move on. And that takes 15, 20, 25, 30 seconds. You eat up quite a bit of time just figuring out that this is really, really bad. Things aren't working, and I need to figure out what to do. So the captain's going through all that. The first officer sitting next to him, if he has command training, he knows I need to start doing some checklists. I need to start running through some problem solving. I need to start figuring out what systems have failed. We know that we have an engine failure. Do we have a dual engine failure? If my screens, my displays in front of me, if we have an electrical emergency, the screens in front of the first officer will blank. It's kind of your principal indication that you have an electrical emergency. The screens in front of the captain don't blank because he's going to be the one, theoretically, that flies in this situation. He may not realize that those screens have blanked. He's so task saturated anyways, he may not correlate it with the fact, hey, we're in an electrical emergency. Is the gear going to come down with normal gear extension, or are we going to have to use the emergency backup extension? He's task loaded. He doesn't have the bandwidth to do everything he needs to do. And if the first officer is waiting for directions from him on what he should do next, which would be very common for a low-time pilot, for a pilot without a lot of command experience, then he could be basically doing nothing in that seat other than being an observer. And I'm not saying that's what he did. I'm saying with that level of experience, the average pilot would not be doing much. They'd be waiting for the captain to tell them what to do, would not necessarily be facilitating and helping the captain out and running checklists and being proactive and going off on a parallel tangent to do things that the captain doesn't have the time to do but that need to be done. A great example of this would be the Miracle on the Hudson. Most people are familiar with Sully Sullenberger. They know Captain Sullenberger by name. A lot of people aren't as familiar with Jeffrey Skiles, who was a first officer. They should be. He was every bit as valuable as Sullenberger in the final outcome of that incident, which is everyone survived. It was a crash. It was in the water. They lost the airplane, but everyone survived, which ultimately, given the circumstance, was the best results you could hope for. Very similar to this, struck a flock of birds, lost power, had a significant reduction in thrust. They may have had a little bit of thrust, but they didn't have much. And Sullenberger took command of the aircraft, took control of the aircraft, communicated with air traffic control, communicated with the flight attendants, figured out he wasn't going to make it to an airport. He didn't have the glide range to make it to an airport, and then selected the Hudson as his emergency landing. While he was doing that, Jeffrey Skiles, sitting next to him, was running all the checklists. And he wasn't asking the captain for permission. He wasn't telling the captain he was having issues. He was trying to solve that problem over there in parallel while Sully was doing what Sully needed to do. And then they came back together again right before they touched down on the water. And then they coordinated for that touchdown on the water. Now, Jeffrey Skiles is very experienced. He had actually been a captain for U.S. Airways. This was towards the thickest part of the Great Recession. So the airline had shrunk. It laid off a lot of people. Skiles was not senior enough to maintain his captain seat. So he got downgraded to first officer. So one of his first trips back after being downgraded. So he had just been a captain. Probably before U.S. Airways, he had a lot of captain experience as well. When you're flying for a major airline in the U.S., you usually have several thousand hours, probably at least 2,000 or 3,000 hours of command experience at a minimum. So he knew command experience. He knew how to coordinate with the captain, but then he knew how to go out and to take command of the duties that he had that the captain couldn't do, and he went and did it. So this, again, is not to blame the first officer, but it is to say, unless the first officer was exemplary at 1650 hours or with very little command experience, he probably wasn't helping the captain out very much. That's just an experience thing. It is what it is. People have to get experience somewhere. He was getting some of his experience here. So I also want to discuss this here. The pilots identified a group of birds while approaching runway 1, and security camera filmed the aircraft coming close to a group of birds during the go-around. They show in this image right here approximately where the CVR FDR stopped depicting information. It's also going to be where the ADSB stopped depicting information. That all happened basically simultaneously. 1.1 nautical miles, 2 kilometers from the end of runway 1. I don't know what security footage they're talking about that details birds around the aircraft. I am familiar with security footage that was captured right around here. So probably a half a mile away from where the initial event took place, you have the security footage. If the security footage that has been distributed, I don't see a group of birds. I do see what looks like some debris coming out of the exhaust of both engines along with the compressor stall, a spike of flame that came out of the number 2 engine. We can see that. I don't know if that's what they're referring to. It doesn't appear to be a flock of birds to me. It's potentially they see some birds there. It would be nice if they took a still of the security footage and they had included it in this preliminary report. They didn't do that. So let's hop into right now and give you a more precise explanation. Again, this is one bit of data. I'm pretty sure, we had the electrical failure here. Transponder, CVR, FDR all stopped operating at this point. Precisely at this point, they stopped operating. That would be a electrical emergency, a significant electrical failure. The bird strike happened somewhere around here. Your second indication that the bird strike occurred either before or concurrently with the go around. We have the data tracing here from Flight Radar 24. The yellow here is a vertical rate. This is a descent down here. You see 0 degrees if you can't see it. That's 0 descent rate here. That spikes into a climb, and then right here it goes back into a descent. We have the numbers actually in CSV format. We'll discuss that, which depicts this as well. And then you have a fairly stable glide path on the way down until it levels off, slight climb, and then slight descent. What you don't have here is airspeed. And if we come here, and this is really where you get into some of the details. So these are all the data points here. Most of them are irrelevant, but you have the altitude over here, and you have the airspeed over here. So you can see this is a very stable approach. 145 knots, 144 knots, 145. Very, very stable. It does have auto throttles. So the aircraft does a pretty good job of maintaining a stable airspeed throughout the approach from when they capture 1,700 feet so until they get to 600 feet. Stable descent rate. Then get to 600 feet, 525. Now you start to see a little bit of degradation in airspeed. 450, and this is where they kind of level off and begin to go around. They're bleeding off airspeed. So they've lost about 4 knots of airspeed there. They end up losing about 6 knots. As they initiate this go around, they cannot accelerate. And the process of a go around in 737 is go around toga flaps 15. That's what the pilot flying is going to say. So go around, you push the go around button, the throttles will move forward into the go around thrust mode, advanced thrust mode, flaps 15. So you're saying I'm going around, I push the toga button and give me flaps 15. You retract from either flaps 30 or flaps 40, depending upon the approach. That's the degrees of flaps. You're taking drag away. You're also taking lift away. So you go to flaps 15. The assumption here is that you get rid of the drag so you can climb. You get rid of the drag so you can accelerate. They climbed, but they didn't accelerate. And 140 knots at flaps 15 is not sufficient airspeed. So they started the climb, and then somewhere in the climb fairly quickly, a captain or whoever was flying identified, we don't have safe airspeed at flaps 15. We need to speed up. We're not accelerating in the climb, which would be the normal, either single engine or two engine. We should be able to accelerate in a climb. We're not able to do that. I need to pitch the nose over to speed up, which is exactly what happens. Start to go around at 450, 625. They have peaked out. The last data point, according to the regulatory authorities in this preliminary report in South Korea, was 161 knots at 498 feet. You got 500 feet here. That matches up pretty good. 154 knots, this is ground speed. There's probably a little bit of a headwind going to the runway. So 161 knots indicated with a little bit of a headwind would be 154 knots. So that all lines up. They gave up on the climb to descend in order to get to a safe airspeed for flaps 15, which is exactly what they should have done. There is no moment in which they are accelerating and climbing at the same time. That does not happen. In fact, even in the descent, it appears that they're decelerating. From here, from 600 feet to 450, they lose 4 knots. And then as they begin to level off at 450, they lose another couple of knots. And so they never climbed and accelerated at the same time, which would indicate that they did not have full thrust at any point during the go-around, which would indicate that they hit the birds before the go-around or else at the same time that they initiated the go-around. We talk about a lot of times in aviation with accidents, what we call a chain of events, the accident chain. If you break one of those links, the accident doesn't occur. You just break one link. Now, the pilots can break links. And in this case, obviously, they didn't break links. That doesn't mean it was their fault. It doesn't mean that they made an egregious error. Obviously, there's going to be some things in hindsight that's easy to call errors, but the question is, was it egregious? I don't think they did anything egregious here. That doesn't mean they didn't do anything questionable. So the decision to go around once they struck the birds, depending on the circumstances, could be questionable. And again, that has to do with, was this a handful of birds? They'd already flown through them, they'd hit them, and then they decided to go around. They had the runway in front of them, they were configured for landing, they were stable, they were on glide path, continue towards the runway and land on the runway after that event. If you can't maintain the glide path, if you can't maintain airspeed because there's too much damage in the engines, hang a left and put it down in the water, splash down if you have to. In their case, they would have been able to make it to runway 1, given the damage they have, given the fact they made it all the way back around to 19. They could have made it to runway 1. They already configured for landing. Why didn't they do that? If it was a handful of birds, that's what they should have done. I can say from my perspective, that's what I would have done. I would have continued the landing, but it's a shock moment. It's a surprise moment. It's a reflexive decision. It's made in a hurry, and decisions in a hurry are almost always going to introduce some form of errors. So I wouldn't call it an egregious error, but it's a questionable decision unless they were dealing with something like this, right? This big group of birds that had flown up at them. They were descending into it, and they needed to get away. They didn't want to continue going through this big gob of birds and keep hitting birds after birds after birds, and they wanted to get away from that. That would make sense to me. That go-around would make sense to me, even after hitting birds. Unfortunately, we have no idea whether it was something like this or if it was 8 or 10 or 12 and that they'd hit a few, they'd flown through them, they're basically on the other side, they could have continued for a landing. We don't know. It would be a questionable decision if they did not continue from a landing there. In any event, they made the decision to go around. They circled out here, and then they realized we can't maintain speed, safe speed, at the same time that we're maintaining altitude. We don't have enough performance to run checklists, to be coordinated in the landing. We need to rush our landing. We need to do it immediately. We need to do it quicker than is prudent if you have any other option. And when you do that, you again make mistakes in a time compressed scenario like that. the inability to lower the gear, the failure to do that. They did have a backup gravity free fall system they could have used. Again, click on the link at the end of the video here if you want to see more about that. I go into quite some detail, but it's right behind the first officer. You pull some cables, the gear will free fall, will gravity free fall. If you have a total electrical failure in the system and you have the number one engine shut down, the gear normally extends off of hydraulic pump A, which is powered by the number one engine. It looks like the number one engine wasn't turning. There is an electrical pump that can back up the engine-driven hydraulic pump, but if you don't have electricity, that electrical pump is not powered either, which means normal gear extension is not possible. And unfortunately, without the CVR, we won't be able to determine whether or not they ever selected the normal gear extension handle down. Did they forget it altogether, or did they extend that gear normally? They kept the gear up. They didn't want to drag, wanted to make sure they got to the runway with limited thrust. That all makes sense. That's all good decision. I would do the same thing. And then as they got close to runway, gear down, they did a normal gear extension, not realizing that the gear wasn't going to extend normally and didn't have enough time to reach back and do an emergency gear extension. I wouldn't consider that type of error to be egregious. It's time compressed, it's chaotic, it's crazy, it's not an egregious error. Unfortunately, if they had gotten the gear down, they probably would have gotten the aircraft stopped on the runway. At the very least, they wouldn't have gone off at the rate of speed they did. It would have been much more survivable. So unfortunate, not egregious. We may not get many details because the cockpit voice recorder wasn't active during that period, neither was a flight data recorder. So we won't know what they were trying to do as far as configuration went. We only know what happened, which was the gear was not extended. One final thing. So the NTSB is looking at this. We already knew that. They're kind of experts as it relates to cockpit voice recorders, flight data recorders, particularly when those units are damaged. There's two preeminent experts, the NTSB and then a Bureau of Aviation in France. Those are kind of the two experts. If you have damaged CVR or FDR units, they're the ones who can really work magic on it. Now they have both the NTSB and the Bureau of Aviation in France involved in this, probably just because Boeing is an American company. I think they're involving both of these entities. The NTSB is going to be involved because it's a Boeing product. The Bureau of Aviation in France is probably a backup to make sure there's no conflicts. Makes sense for them to do that. That's the update. Again, it looks like obviously birds were the causal factor here. They're going to be the probable cause. Bird ingestion, significant loss of thrust on number two engine, probably a total loss of thrust on number one engine. They don't have the FDR data. They may not be able to state that conclusively, but that I think we have pretty good evidence of that, combined with a total loss of normal electrical generation systems. The generators on the engines, they had a loss of that as well. What the pilots could have done to prevent it was continue the landing. If that was a possibility, it may not have been. And then if they couldn't continue the landing, they did have an auxiliary power unit. It takes about a minute to start that and get a generator online from that system. If they'd gotten that generator online from that system, they could have extended flaps and gear normally for the landing, as opposed to having to do an abnormal gear or flap extension for the landing under the emergency electrical system. Why they didn't turn the APU on, we have no idea. They don't state whether it's functional or not. Generally, it is functional. It can be on a minimum equipment list, which means it's non-functional for a limited number of flights. They don't state that it was, so the presumption is that was available, and if they had an electrical emergency, they did not utilize that. Why didn't they utilize that? We won't know without a cockpit voice recorder, flight data recorder. That becomes a crew issue, a potential link in the accident chain that the crew could have broken. Again, wouldn't consider it egregious, but it is questionable if they had that resource and they didn't utilize it. It would be questionable to continue the landing if they were through the birds, if the threat was gone, they were configured for landing. It'd be questionable not to continue the landing if you don't look at the fireball when you consider what egregious is. If you look at the aftermath, if you look at the fireball, if you look at the wreckage, every decision that led up to it is going to feel like it was an egregious mistake or an egregious error. I don't think there was egregious mistakes or egregious errors, but I don't think that it was prime performance by the air crew either, is kind of what we're looking at this point in time. And again, not a lot of experience in the right seat. I'm not sure how much of this is a captain's fault. And really, I'm not saying it's a first officer's fault. I'm just saying he was limited by experience, and that probably didn't facilitate a very dynamic, very difficult, very time compressed, very confusing type of a scenario and situation. So anyways, we want to just thoughts and prayers to the family members. Obviously horrible for them. Hopefully we can find some resolution, get some good safety data out there so that something like this will not happen again in the future. Like and subscribe. Follow me over on Patreon. Appreciate you. Stay safe.